Alrighty, welcome back to another episode of Cut Rate History, in our series of episodes on American history. Still a little bit under the weather. Apologize for that. I'm sure I sound a little bit stuffy, but we're going to power through. Today, we're going to talk about what is going on in Europe, how that is kind of setting the stage for World War II. In our last episode, we talked about what was going on for the American home front and how that was kind of setting things up for World War II. Today, we're going to look basically at everybody else. I'm going to warn you guys up front, there's a lot of very unpleasant things to talk about in this episode. We're going to talk about a lot of death and killings and very unfortunate ways to go about that. There's a lot of very bad people who are coming to power during this time period. So um, just keep that in mind as we move forward. That said, let's hop into it. So, the depression we talked about last time, that is very much expanding to Europe. And Europe didn't really get the Roaring Twenties the way that America did. Remember, after World War One, Europe is basically destroyed. They are in the period where the United States is having this wonderful period of expansion and affluence and wealth. Europe is simply rebuilding. They never get this lull in terrible conditions. They go from World War One to this awful period of trying to rebuild with no money, and then getting dropped into the Great Depression. And then, for that matter, basically right into World War Two. Um, the U.S. gets this little reprieve of the Roaring Twenties, how artificial it may have been. So, all of this in mind, this is changing the way that people think in Europe, and especially Germany. Remember, we talked about how France was really mad at the end of World War One, and they designed the Treaty of Versailles to punish Germany as much as possible. So, of everybody who's doing very poorly in Europe, which is most people, Germany is doing arguably the worst. They're very desperate, they're struggling, and the people are looking for something to latch on to. Anything they can to end the suffering. And when this guy comes along who pushes forward these radical ideas, it gives these people someone to blame and someone to hate for how badly things are going right now. Just using this to kind of set the stage, understand people who are this desperate are easy to manipulate. And that is how a lot of the people who come to power do so quickly, and with such force. Um, Meaning they come to power quickly, but also they gain way more power than the previous government would have allowed in a different circumstance. So first, we're going to talk about Italy and Mussolini. So right after the war, 1919, Benito Mussolini founds Italy's fascist party. And fascist in like the actual meaning of fascism, not the stuff that gets thrown around today in like the U.S. political culture. Uh, Fascism is authoritarian. It's dictators. It's suppression. It's a regimentation of society and the economy. It's all of these awful things that the United States is not experiencing, regardless of which aisle you're on. This is true fascism. People were suffering immensely under what was happening and what Benito Mussolini was setting up here. One thing to keep in mind is when Mussolini sets up this fascism in Italy specifically, um, a point of this, a point of contention for him, is a massive distaste for communism. Now, Mussolini runs his campaign, for lack of a better word, on this idea of returning Italy to the former glory of the Roman Empire. He is going to restore Italy to its rightful place on the world stage. He says all these wonderful things that people want to hear because Italy is destroyed after World War One, despite switching sides. It didn't free them from the consequences of a war near their homeland. So Mussolini puts together a group of people. It's basically a paramilitary wing of his political campaign. They're a fascist militia. He calls them the black shirts because guess what color their shirts were? And he threatens to march on Rome in 1922. And it's this threat that the King of Italy's advisors basically say to him, look, just give Mussolini what he wants, put him in a position of perceived power, so he kind of goes away and doesn't, mess all this stuff up. What they didn't understand was, quite frankly, how savvy Mussolini was. So he gets put in this position called the premier, which is kind of like could be equated to like the U.S. vice president in that it's kind of a nothing position, but leveraged correctly, it could be an immensely powerful position. So Mussolini's going to pull a Dick Cheney here and start moving everything from the shadows. And very quickly, Mussolini sets up a dictatorship. He ousts the king, he takes over the country, and this all happens in 1922. He like resets the clock, so there's a fascist timeline and then there's like a global timeline. You'll see that with like firearms development and art and stuff like that. It'll be like the year 5, but it'll be 1927, stuff like that. The Soviets. We're going to talk about Stalin. But before we talk about him, we need to talk about something else. There is a forgotten Holocaust that occurs even before the Nazis are a thing. It's called the Holodomor. Like a lot of other places, people in the Soviet Union are very desperate, they're very poor, they're in all of the same situation that we've been talking about. And this leads to a lot of paranoia in the Soviet government. Spoiler alert, that's not going to go away ever, basically. And they create a couple of like secret police agencies and a bunch of government agencies like our CIA and NSA and DEA and things like that. They are similarly acronyms. Today we're going to talk about the KGB and the NKVD. So it's 1932. The NKVD, very long story short, they release a man-made famine into Ukraine. And it kills more than 5 million people. It orphans over 1 million children. It's awful. This is a Ukrainian Holocaust. This is similar in numbers to the amount of Jews that were killed by the Nazis. This is a really big deal. And it's shocking to me that more people don't know about this. I don't like that like mainstream history doesn't talk about this. We're going to talk about something else that's very similar to this that puts it in the same situation. The Jewish Holocaust really overshadows a lot of the stuff that happens in roughly the same time period. Anyways, if you weren't killed by the famine, starvation was such a threat that a lot of people resorted to cannibalism. This cannibalism and lack of proper nutrition led to even more disease and more sickness and more death. The Holodomor was a god awful, terrible thing, and the Soviets did it. That could be argued a lot of different ways. Honestly, it seems as though they did it basically just to see if they could, like the CIA does a lot. Anyways, keep this in mind. This is the kind of thing that's going on for the Soviets. Now, Stalin becomes the new dictator of the USSR a few years after World War I ends in 1926. So keep in mind, this is a couple years also after Mussolini takes power in Italy. Under his rule, wages fall by, it's almost 50%. It's like 43 or 44% that wages fall by. And he's not looking good, so he puts together this new constitution, and in the drafts he promises a whole bunch of stuff. He promises his citizens a bunch of new freedoms. However, spoiler alert, they are never enforced. People never actually get these freedoms, regardless of the fact that they are on paper and they are legally obliged to have them. Under Stalin, a bunch more awful stuff is gonna happen. Collectives become a thing, which is government-owned farms. We talked about a couple episodes ago the difference between Marxism and Stalinism and Ho Chi Minh and all that kind of stuff. This is Stalinism at its finest. Forcibly taking family farms and then giving them to the government. And if you said, no, this is my family farm, this is how I make a living, this is how we stay alive, part of this is basically subsistence farming, too bad you were executed. This is the authoritarianism in Stalinism that he becomes known for. Um, Ironically, after the Holodomor, 10 million Soviet citizens are going to die as a result of famine just between 1932 and 1933. Basically, as a result of poor management from the government because people were so malnourished that they didn't have the immune system to fight off stuff that they previously could have. Stalin is also going to set up what we would now call concentration camps, what at the time they called gulags. Um, and in the Arctic, he's going to use prisoners as slave labor. All of the things that you would normally associate with concentration camps, even in the Nazi context, Stalin is doing, a decade before the Nazis were. Um, Very stereotypically communist. There is a zero tolerance for opposition, political opponents, stuff like that. Other stuff also, like artists, if he didn't like the art that you were doing, or intellectuals, if you weren't studying the things that he wanted you to study, it was an odd, very fuzzy line between the people who were celebrated and the people who were executed. Um, on top of that, these types of people, they were accused of all kinds of crazy things. There were forced confessions. He murdered several of his countrymen. Under Stalin, 20 million Soviet citizens are going to die. That is double what is attributed to Hitler and the Holocaust. If you A fun fact, maybe not a fun fact, an interesting fact is Stalin basically came up with the idea of Photoshop. So these political opponents or his fellow countrymen or people within the government, he is having assassinated, murdered, executed, covered up. However, these people still existed in photos with Stalin, and that didn't sit well with him. So he had a team of people who would go back through photographs and erase people from these photographs. They would go back through government documents and redact any evidence of them being there. They would go through old newspapers and redact everything. It was as if these people never even existed. Insane to think about. Now, a kind of a forgotten entity here is Japan. Japan's escapades in the 1930s really, again, are not talked about, kind of in the same way that the Holodomor isn't talked about. It just is not mainstream history. So it kind of gets forgotten or left behind unless you're a nerd like me or, I don't know, really just nerds. Japan's economy implodes. Like everywhere else after World War I that we've been talking about, economy is in shambles. It's doing very poorly. Also, remember, We didn't talk a whole lot about Japan during World War One. However, they were absolutely in World War One. They were on the Allied side, ironically, because just before World War One, they had the Russo-Japanese War, which they hadn't recovered from when World War One started. So they're sitting on the debts and demands of two wars back to back, and now they're in this giant recession, and things are not looking good. Basically, like everywhere in Europe that we've been talking about. Their economy is in a state of chronic depression, and a lot of people blamed it on the Western influence that came from World War One. After World War One, Japan joined Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, and there was a perceived failure of the League of Nations. We'll talk about why in the next slide. Um, but a lot of people blamed their problems on the West and like joining up with them in the League of Nations. So this is going to turn into a period of very much isolation. They are going to look inward. They're going to turn to nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism and dictatorship, the same way a lot of other countries in Europe are. These problems that they are facing are not unique to Japan, and they are dealing with them in a very similar fashion to everybody else. Now, with this new dictatorship and authoritarianism, like we just talked about with Stalin, assassinations are commonplace. Fascism is becoming the norm. Now, did Japan call it fascism? No, they did not. But in hindsight, as historians, we can look back and say, whoa, this is all of the same things. This is absolutely fascism. So, this desperation is going to lead to an invasion of Manchuria. So Japan's economy is doing so poorly. The new government is going to push to expand their imperial borders. Remember, at this time, they also occupy Korea, the whole Korean peninsula. By 1931, they decide they're going to invade Manchuria, which is arguably, it's part of China. And they have a bunch of natural resources there that they can use, like iron and coal. And in this area, they're fairly easy to extract and use, so maybe they can use this to kind of kickstart the Japanese economy. And things start looking up for them for a minute or two, but the League of Nations then condemns the invasion of Manchuria, and they were going to kick Japan out, but Japan was like, oh, you can't kick us out, we're leaving. It was a mutual breakup, for a lack of better terms. And also during this time period, there are a bunch of what some contemporary scholars are calling incidents, and they happen all throughout China, Korea, Manchuria. There are labor strikes, there are assassinations, there are executions. People are really upset about the Japanese being there in both China and Korea, and this it's so much unrest on both sides. Japan says, screw it, we're going to mount a full-scale invasion of China. They invade China in 1937, and this leads to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of thousands of civilians. There are a long list of incidents that happen with the Japanese military in China in the late 1930s, and none of them are good. However, the most famous is the rape of it's the Nanking massacre, and then there was a book and a movie called The Rape of Nanking. So now it is often referred to as the rape of Nanking, and like I alluded to before, it's another forgotten Holocaust. So the Battle of Nanking ends on December 3rd, 1937. And the battle happened in the first place because Nanking was the capital of the Republic of China at the time. Japanese troops go through this city, and remember, it's the capital. There's a ton of people there. Some of them were soldiers. The vast majority of them were civilians, and they went through summarily executing everybody. It was atrocious. I got a quote on the slide. I'm going to read it to you. The widespread rape of female civilians took place, their ages ranging from infants to the elderly. Disgusting. Disgustingly heinous behavior. And if that weren't bad enough, most of them were murdered afterwards. It didn't stop there. Civilians were tortured, looted, killed, executed, put in mass graves, and the soldiers had contests. How many can you kill in X amount of time? Oh, I killed Y amount yesterday. Disgusting. The kinds of things that you hear about Nazi soldiers like the Einsatzgruppen that we're going to talk about here in another couple minutes, but nobody ever talks about Japan doing the very same things. It irks me that they kind of get off scot-free. And I think a lot of this gets attributed to the dropping of the atomic bombs, the the reassignment of Japan as the Western friend in the Pacific after China falls to communism. Anyways, video for another time. I will make a video on that. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. Anyways, a third of the city is burned to the ground. These Japanese soldiers had a taste for arson. They loved it. And this wasn't just like a couple of days. Like I said, it starts December 13th in 37. It doesn't stop until March 28th of 1938. This is not an isolated incident. It wasn't the first. It most certainly was not the last. It just happens to be the most famous. Um, Incidents like this happened all throughout China until the end of World War II when they got booted out because they lost. Because we unleashed the power of the sun on them twice. Sorry. I get a little heated. My bad. Moving on. A much arguably worse topic. Hitler in Germany. So Hitler was Austrian. He fought for Germany in World War One, and like a lot of other German World War One veterans, he was very angry. Um, you know, for good reason. With the Treaty of Versailles, it was France were they were being a bunch of dicks. Quite frankly, they they treated Germany very poorly, and if they hadn't done that, I think it's easily argued that the 1930s would have gone very different. Now, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi, which is the acronym in German, gets founded on the ideals of extreme nationalism, expanding Germany's territory, and disregarding the terms of the World War I treaties. Sound familiar? I'm sure not. One big incident was called the Beer Hall Push. It was basically a failed coup. They were going to put Hitler in charge, and long story short, it didn't. This is where he gets put in jail, and this is the time period where he writes Mein Kampf. And he calls for this thing called the Anschluss. And what this is, in broad terms, is a unification of all Germanic people. People of like being ethnically German. We talked about how Germany's kind of a new country coming together in the latter half of the 1800s. But people who can claim that kind of descent, he wants those people to all come together. Remember, I told you self-determination and that kind of ideal system was going to come back, and it comes back here. Now, also in Mein Kampf is where he describes the master race that of Aryans, blonde hair, blue-eyed people. Everybody's heard that. Now, like I alluded to before, these ideals sound crazy to us today, and rightfully so. However, remember, these people are so desperate. They're looking for people to blame. They're looking for something to latch on to pull them out of this awful depression, and it opens them up to these radical ideas. These policies expand. So Hitler says, the Slavic people are subhuman. They should be enslaved by the Germans. They're not fit to, mingle among this Aryan race. it wasn't just the Slavic people. We'll talk. There's going to be a whole pile of them, but most famously, his racism is strongest towards the Jews, and he blames the Jews for a lot of the world's problems. He blames them for the Treaty of Versailles. He blames them for the Germany's defeat in general in World War One. He blames them for the Depression and how poorly Germany is doing. And it doesn't happen overnight. However, Hitler does slowly begin to have members of his Nazi party gain positions in the German government. And by 1933, the German president appoints Hitler as chancellor. This is kind of a similar position to where Mussolini was before he ousted the king as premier. So, like Mussolini's black shirts, the Nazi Party also had paramilitary units. He eventually they would be called stormtroopers. Stormtrooping that will come later. Initially, they're called brown shirts because guess what color their shirts were. He ends up actually murdering a bunch of those guys. That's a story for another time. Anyways, these stormtroopers they start intimidating voters, all kinds of stuff. They, pay people off. They're bailing people out. They're bribing people. They're doing all kinds of stuff. And soon enough, the German government, which is called the Reichstag, is overwhelmingly members of the Nazi political party. And with this majority of members, these Nazi political party members then vote to give Hitler dictatorial powers, and that's how we get Nazi Germany as we kind of think about it stereotypically. Now, we said Nazism, one of their founding principles, one of their founding pillars, was to disregard the Treaty of Versailles. And Hitler does it pretty quick. He gets those dictatorial powers in 34. By 35, Germany starts building an air force, which they weren't allowed to have. They employ a draft. They expand their army. They start building guns again. None of this stuff they were allowed to do. And they're going to do it because Hitler wants to go through or achieve the Anschluss. And to do this, he needs to annex Austria and Czechoslovakia. So Hitler's army invades Austria. They take it by force. There wasn't a lot of resistance, honestly. And so now they're looking more towards Czechoslovakia. In the area of Czechoslovakia that Hitler wants to incorporate in the Anschluss is called the Sudetenland. This Sudetenland was given to him without having to invade. It's odd. This piece of Czechoslovakia was given to Hitler of Germany by France and Britain. And you say, well, how do they possibly have the authority to give a piece of another country to a different country that they're not even a part of? Excellent question. Basically, they went to Czechoslovakia and said, listen, you're going to give him this piece of land because we don't want another world war. We need to appease him. And this becomes policy. It was literally called the policy of appeasement. Basically, give Hitler whatever he wants. That way he doesn't take it by force, causing another war. Unfortunately, appeasement doesn't work. The Sudetenland wasn't enough, and by 1939, Germany had invaded the entirety of Czechoslovakia and placed the whole country under German control. Now, kind of the last piece of the Anschluss puzzle here is part of Poland. There's a non-trivial Polish population that is of German descent at this time period. Specifically, in the city of Danzig, 90% of the population was German. And obviously that makes Hitler want it to be under German control. That's how the Anschluss works. That's how self-determination in itself works. And At this point, France and Britain say, listen, we tried doing things the nice way. We tried giving you what we thought it is that you wanted. We're drawing the line in the sand at Poland. If you invade Poland, we will declare war on you. Now, we're going to talk about the Nuremberg laws that Hitler puts in place while all of the rest of what we were just happening, or just talked about, was happening. These laws specifically targeted all of the people who the Nazis hated. So we talked about the Slavs and the Jews, but also disabled people, crippled people, gypsies, homosexuals, communists. If you remember, communists are also hated by Mussolini, and we'll get there in a second. Now, one important thing to keep in mind that I remember being a small child and learning about World War II and having a really hard time understanding how the Nazis viewed Jewish people. To me, as a child, understanding what Judaism was, um, I was just like, well, why don't they just say they're not Jewish? um, which is a naive thing to think. The Nazis viewed Judaism or being Jewish as a race and not as part of a religion. You could be Catholic, but if your grandmother was Jewish, you're Jewish. It was delineated as, it was passed down in posterity. It was, you know, in your family tree. Couldn't escape it. That kinds of things. Now, these Nuremberg laws get passed at the beginning of 1935. And I have a list here. These are the kinds of things that they did. Now, the first thing is define a Jewish person. That's kind of what I was just alluding to. A Jewish person, in Nazi context, is anyone that has at least one Jewish grandparent. So, like I said, you could be literally a Catholic priest, but if your grandmother was Jewish, you're Jewish. Doesn't matter. They segregated the Jews, they put them in ghettos, and then they stopped them from being able to do stuff. They couldn't own property, they couldn't technically be citizens, they couldn't marry non Jewish people, they couldn't hold office, they couldn't vote. They made them change their names. If you were a Jewish person with a German or Germanic sounding name, they made you change your name to something more Jewish. Excuse me. Prohibited Jews from being civil servants and journalists and farmers, all kinds of things. Jewish people couldn't even use the sidewalk under the Nuremberg laws. An incredible revocation of rights you didn't even think you had or didn't want to lose. Who thinks about being able to use a sidewalk? It's a sidewalk. I didn't even think about it. But they lost the right to use them. Insane. Kristallnacht is German for the night of broken glass. How this all comes to be is Hitler's government, they deport 10,000 Jews. And in response to this, a man named Herschel Grinspan assassinates a German diplomat because one of those 10,000 Jews was his father. So, in reprisal for that deportation, Grinspan assassinates a German diplomat. Now, in reprisal to the reprisal, it was this thing that gets called Kristallnacht. It's November 9th, 1938, and a bunch of Hitler's followers, so his brown shirts, his paramilitary, people who are just part of the Nazi Party, people who are Nazi sympathizers, all kinds of things. They go out and just cause massive violence. They destroy 7,500 Jewish businesses. They wreck a bunch of synagogues. They torch their homes and their schools. And before they started doing this, Nazi officials went to the police and forbade them from stopping any of this from happening. By the time all the dust settled, there were 90 Jews dead, hundreds were injured. And then if that weren't bad enough, the Nazi secret police, or Gestapo, they go ahead and they arrest 20,000 wealthy Jewish people and basically said, you're going to go to jail forever, or you have two options. You can either leave the country or give us all of your stuff. This is when we start seeing mass emigration of Jews, to the point where so many countries are taking in so many people that countries start putting caps on it. We can't take more people. We don't have accommodations for more people, and that it is unfortunate for the people trying to escape persecution. Now, the Jewish question gets brought up a lot. There were a lot of ideas about it, but what needs to be understood to understand kind of what was happening is, for the Nazis, the Jews were the main enemy. They were seen as these like puppet masters. They were pulling the strings of all of the other enemies of the Nazis, all of the other people that they were persecuting and that they hated. They believed that the Jews were the ones orchestrating everything. And because this radicalization of the Nazis was so complete and so rampant, they believed that they were doing the right thing. And because they thought they were doing the right thing, that's how they justified what they were doing. And it helped that they were dehumanizing them. They didn't look at them as people because it was easier to do these heinous things to them if they didn't look at them as people. They were partisans, they were rats, they were enemies of the state, they were whatever they wanted to call them, other than human. Now, the first idea was the Nazis just wanted to get rid of all of the Jews from Europe. So one of the first ideas was, let's just deport them all somewhere else. One of the first ideas thrown out there was, let's just put them all on an island. Madagascar was thrown out there. This was seen as too difficult, too costly. The second major idea turned into mass sterilization, and they went along with this for a while. Tens of thousands of Jews were sterilized, but this was taking too long. For this plan to succeed, they would have to wait generations to be rid of the Jews. So this was taking too long for the Nazis. It wasn't happening fast enough. So it's here that they turn to genocide, basically by mass execution. We're going to see this mass execution develop into different strategies later, but it will all culminate in the concentration camp idea, basically. A great movie that talks about and showcases how this transition happened and who was behind it is Conspiracy. I think it's on Amazon Prime. Excellent movie that kind of showcases how this happened, who came to power, whose ideas it were, or whose ideas it was. Very good movie. Definitely recommend it. But also one thing to keep in mind, it wasn't just the Nazis who were doing this kinds of things to the Jews. It wasn't just the Jews who these things were happening to. Um, so, like, for example, Soviets who were captured by the Nazis were taking, who were executing these people. They were carrying out the act of executing these Jews under the pretense that the Nazis were like, hey, if you help us kill all these Jews, we'll set you free. Not what happened. It's a lot of this happened with the invasion of Russia. The Operation Barbarossa turned into literal neighbors killing neighbors. It was terrible. we'll talk more about how the Holocaust actually like logistically went later, but keep in mind this is the beginning. This is kind of where it came from. Um, with expanding on what I just kind of led to about the concentration camps, um, instead of deporting the Jews outside of the country or outside of the continent to someplace else, they're going to be rounded up and sent to different prisons, basically around Europe. Some of them were in Germany, some of them were in Poland. All of these people are registered, marked. They're forced to give up basically everything they have. Their everything from their gold teeth to their shoes, their art, their gold, everything. And they're marched off to initially ghettos where they'd be held for a while. And then if they decided, okay, we're not going to kill you, they'd send you to a concentration camp where again they decide, hey, do we want to kill this person? Do we want to put them to hard labor? They do it again. These camps, like I said, they're ran like prisons with the most heinous consequences you could possibly imagine. And as the Jewish question and the solutions to it evolve, these camps turn into extermination camps. This is where a lot of the mass executions are taking place, and it actually came to the point where shooting them was taking too long. So they developed chemicals that they would put in mass showers to gas them to death. They would put them in giant blast furnaces. Awful, awful things. By the end of the war in 1945, the Nazis will have murdered over 13 million people, um, and roughly 6 million of them were Jews. I have the Bastards opening clip listed here on the bottom. I used to show the opening scene to Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, where Christoph Waltz goes and interrogates that French farmer. And is that scene hyperbolic? Absolutely. However, it absolutely gets the point across of what occupation life was like, what it was like when the Nazis were looking for Jews, things like that. It's kind of the same way that another Tarantino movie I used to use was Django. When I was teaching, you know, antebellum South, slavery, how they were treated, things like that. The scene where they're explaining why Brumhilde is treated so poorly, and the scene where she gets whipped for trying to run away. Is that hyperbolic again? Yes, absolutely. However, things like that certainly did happen. So just because things are exaggerated in movies doesn't mean they can't be used as a learning tool. And it also definitely doesn't mean things like that didn't happen, in some of the worst cases. Um, just a map of what is going on. So this is what Germany was before and was like looking to become. Now, what is also on here are all of these dots are concentration camps. Some of the most famous ones are places like Buchenwald, Dachau, um, things like that. And then obviously you can see in Poland there's Auschwitz, Krakow, Treblinka. It would be that'll become a Soviet gulag later, which is ironic. But just a map of kind of what's going on there. Now, inside of these concentration camps, if that weren't bad enough, the Nazis were doing all kinds of fucked up experiments. Um, and the head of all of these screwed up experiments was a guy nicknamed the Angel of Death. His real name was Josef Mengele, and he was the head doctor at Auschwitz. Now, it's important to remember that Auschwitz is not in Germany, it's in Poland. And it's Auschwitz-Birkenau. Birkenau was like the execution side, kind of. And he did all, like I said, he did all kinds of awful experiments. He would try to change people's eye color by injecting their eyeballs with different chemicals. He had an obsession with pregnant women and twins. They're twins. He would take them and like cut both of their left arms off and then try to sew them on the other one to see if they would work. This I don't even. I'm not even going to talk about the stuff he did with pregnant women. You guys can go look it up for yourself. It's awful, and I don't feel like talking about it right here. Heinous stuff, and he documented a lot of this stuff. Um, like he thought he was doing like genuine medical work. Something else I don't have a full slide on here, but is similar is Japan's Unit 731, who did kind of a lot of the same things during the same time period. Another example of Japan doing heinous, awful things at the same time as the Nazis, doing the same kinds of things as the Nazis, and then getting away with it. But they're responsible for, oh God, a lot of heinous things. Uh, for example, they're the reason that we know a human body is roughly 75 or 80% water because they turned several people into beef jerky and then weighed them before and after. They did a lot of cool stuff like that. Anyways, I put this slide in here because remember, I wrote a lot of this stuff originally for high school aged kids. But it doesn't mean it's not important for you, the listener, right now. Question everything. Just because a person who is in charge or a person of authority says something is, X way, doesn't mean that it is. Remember, there is no evidence for a lot of the stuff that these dictators are putting forward, yet it becomes the cornerstone of belief for some of the most powerful movements in U.S. history. All of this stuff, all of these heinous things, Unit 731, Joseph Mengele, the concentration camps, fascist Italy, all of this stuff is endorsed by the government. The people in charge, the people who are supposed to be taking care of you, are saying that this stuff is okay. Again, yes, very hyperbolic, but just keep in mind, just because the government or somebody in charge says it's okay doesn't mean that it actually is. Question everything, think for yourself. Okay, rant over. Sorry. The Axis powers, they come together. So, Hitler and Mussolini come together basically on their shared hatred of communism. They're going to cooperate on some international issues, and this becomes known as the Rome-Berlin Axis. This is where the Axis powers get their name. Like we said before, Japan at this time is becoming imperialistic, militaristic, authoritarian, things of that nature. And like Mussolini and Hitler, this new authoritarian imperialist Japan also hated communists. So all of these guys come together and they sign this thing called the Anti-Comintern Pact. And basically it just says, listen, if any of us find out anything about some communist groups who are operating, doing whatever things, we're just going to share that information with each other so that we're all on the same page about what's kind of going on globally. And despite all of this working together in the mid to late 1930s, it's not until September of 1940 that they formally come together as allies, creating the Axis powers. So, spoiler alert, a little bit. This is after technically the beginning of World War II, but before the United States enters the war. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Basically, this was supposed to be a little bit of security for Russia. It starts off with Germany not wanting to fight a war on two fronts. They did it in World War One. They knew how hard it was. They didn't want to do it again. So they get the Soviets to sign a non-aggression pact. Basically, it's good for everybody. The Soviets think like, oh, if we don't have to fight the Germans, then we can pit all the capitalist countries against each other, and then we'll only have to deal with who's left once they're all done fighting each other. So this sounds good basically for everybody, even the West. What the West didn't know was that this pact had a secret clause to eventually divide Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union. September 1st, Germany invades Warsaw, Poland, and officially begins World War II. Remember, France and Britain gave Germany the ultimatum. They said, if you invade Poland, we will declare war on you. And they do, and so they do. Little over a month later, on October 5th, Poland has fallen to the Nazis. Um, the basically the Germans and the Soviets meet in the middle, and then they carve it up how they see fit. What I have in there in the corner there is another Fat Electrician video on some mailmen in Poland who took up arms against the Nazis. This was some of the first ever combat in World War II, officially speaking. If you don't count like the Asian theater, um, it's a fantastic video. Again, I know you can't click on it here. It's for me to remember to link it in the description. But great video. Talks about the opening of World War II. Talks about another little piece of history that a lot of people don't know about. I found it super fascinating. So if you liked this, definitely watch that too. Give him some love. You guys know how much I love the Fat Electrician. And then, again, I have another Jeopardy if you guys want to go check it out. But if you made it this far, I appreciate you coming out. Next time, we will talk about World War II in earnest. Now, keep in mind, we're doing this fairly topically. World War II is a massive topic. There are several college courses on World War II alone. I'm going to do my best to attempt to cover the highlights in one video, and then, like I've said before, we'll go back, we'll do vignettes about smaller, more intricate topics later. But if you made it this far, thank you very much for coming out. Please do like and subscribe. Like I said, I would love for this to be a full-time gig. I'd love to keep doing this. I find it really fun. I like interacting with you guys. So throw some comments down there. Let's have a chat, and I'll catch you in the next one.